All right, so there we go. Looks like this mic is now on. All right, well, thank you all for coming. My name is Jamil Jaffer, and our second panel of the day will be the U.S. policy in Syria, stay in, get out, or triple down. So the question we'll be discussing is, what is the U.S. policy in Syria? What is it working? And if not, how should we change it? I'd like to introduce my three panelists, starting from my far left, Roule. Norm served for 34 years in the Central Intelligence Agency, managing significant programs related to the Middle East. He served in the DO as Division Chief, Deputy Division Chief, and Chief of Station. He held multiple senior assignments in Washington, as well as overseas assignments for over 15 years. He's also a visiting fellow at our National Security Institute. Dana Stroul, immediately to Norm's right, is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute's Beth and David Geldilga program on Arab politics. She previously served for 5 years as a senior professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where I had the opportunity to work with her. And she covered Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey. In that capacity, she played a central role in oversight of the State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development, which included overseeing U.S. foreign assistance and weapons sales, as well as crafting relevant legislation. And immediately to my left is Katherine Zimmerman. She's a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the research manager for AEI's Critical Threats Project. As AEI's senior analyst studying terrorist groups, she focuses on the global al-Qaeda network, including their activities in the Arabian Peninsula, Yemen, and the Sahel. She also covers the Salafi jihadi movement and related trends in Middle East and Africa. So I guess my first question is, and I'll start with Katie, because you're immediately by the left, unfortunately for you. What is the U.S. policy in Syria, and is it working?
Great question. I think that it's very clear that we have policies in Syria, and I would say they're not working toward our objectives. So we have a policy of defeating the Islamic State, and then we have one that is countering the Assad regime. But what's missing from what we have is the policy to actually defeat the Islamic State and al-Qaeda from Syria. People forget that there is al-Qaeda elements still in northwest Syria. And I would say, frankly, the other part that has been missing has been the idea of countering Iran regionally. It's not reflected in terms of the policy inside of Syria in any real terms.
Great. Thanks, Katie. And I should mention that I've asked each of the panelists to keep their opening response to these questions down to 2 minutes. So if they're giving short responses, that's why. We're hoping to keep it a little punchy. So, Dana, U.S. policy in Syria, is there one? Is it working? And if not, what should we do?
There is one. And if you listen to certain senior administration officials like Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, who leads our Syria strategy, as well as the United States participation in the global coalition to defeat ISIS, he will say there's three priorities. The first one is the enduring defeat of ISIS. The second line of effort, is the removal of all Iranian boots from Syria. And the third is a sustainable political process that can end the underlying civil war, civil conflict in Syria. So I would agree with Katie that it is not working if you measure all of those objectives up. Certainly in the past couple months, we've seen the territorial defeat of ISIS, but in terms of defining what an enduring defeat of ISIS is, we are not there yet. Removal of all Iranian boots from Syria is a very, very lofty goal. I don't see the resources committed at this point, and certainly in the current this week and by the minute escalation of words and perhaps more with Iran. The notion that in any sort of near term we're going to remove all Iranian forces, Iranian-backed forces, and Iranian forces themselves from Syria seems very unrealistic. And finally, for an enduring political process, the United States continues to support a UN-led process, which seems rather stalled, if not having no momentum whatsoever.
All right, Norm, to you.
We have a policy. It's been very grandly articulated. I'd like to take this into two other quick directions. We have Jim Jeffrey leading this effort. He's one of the most seasoned, capable individuals I've known in my entire career. He's exactly the sort of person you want doing this. So you can have confidence that there's the right person who is working this. The second point is, this is a policy hurricane. It's impossible, utterly impossible to think that any of these things can have an easy path out. This is long-term. This is going to rely upon a lot of 2 steps forward, 1.5, 3 steps back days. This is just how the world works in this sort of conflict. And we're not really authorized, as the previous panel very articulately noted, there's no specific authorizations for this. Congress has not authorized money for much of this. And our allies and in our domestic polity is not really prepared to make the type of choices needed to cleanly and effectively address these issues given the associated costs that they would accompany. Thank you.
So, Dana, if Norm is right that the American public isn't ready to support it, or at least our members, our Congress hasn't done anything to authorize the conflict and really hasn't funded it, is there a possible path to even giving Jim Jeffries, as esteemed a diplomat as he is and as long an experience he has, is there any real path for giving him a successful option?
It seems to me at this point in time, so first of all, following up on what Norm said about where the American public is, one of the most interesting polls that I saw after the president's December tweet that our forces in Syria were coming home was just how popular it was with the American public. It was also extremely popular to the far left of the Democratic caucus and to the far right of the Republican caucus. In the middle, however, it's been actually quite unifying. You hear a lot of agreement among Republican and Democratic members of Congress on the Hill and in the foreign policy establishment here in Washington that a premature withdrawal of U.S. military forces would be disastrous for our Syria policy. I agree Jim Jeffrey is absolutely the person you want at this point in time. The question is, does he speak with authority? Does he represent the President of the United States when he talks about what our strategy in Syria is and when he testifies to Congress about it, or when he asks for resources? So there have been some resources put into it, whether it's authorizing training and assistance and funding for the Syrian Democratic Forces in northeastern Syria to continue the fight against ISIS. There's been funding for humanitarian work. There's funding for some cross-border assistance. There was congressional authorization for stabilization assistance. The question is, does the United States speak as one voice? And given, I think, the fact that globally there is questions as to what the U.S. policy is, whether or not our military is staying there, and if we are going to stay in Syria, for how long. It's very hard for coalition partners inside the coalition or our adversaries who see this as a great opportunity to take advantage and say, see, the United States has no staying power, so you might as well cut a deal with us. So I would say for Jim Jeffrey, really tall order, because right now there's low credibility of the United States in the region. And secondly, no matter what the resource commitment of the United States could be over the next couple of years, it will never match the investment of the Russians and the Iranians in Syria.
So, Katie, you focus on Al-Qaeda and terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. The president told us ISIS has been defeated. Dana just said that ISIS suffered a territorial defeat. Are they gone? Is ISIS dead in the water? Have we beat ISIS? Is the game up? And if we beat ISIS, which I don't think we have, but let's assume we have, what about Al-Qaeda? Are they still a problem in the region? If they are a problem, I think you said earlier, what do we do about that? And what do we do about that in the context of the president thinking about leaving?
I get the rest of the hour, right?
Get the rest of the hour.
Okay. Right. So the Islamic State is not defeated, and one of the challenges that we have when
So the president was wrong.
He's using the wrong metrics.
Okay.
And this is one of the challenges we have when we look at these groups, is that we define defeat and success against the Islamic State and against Al-Qaeda and other groups like them by how many square kilometers they hold, how many terrorist fighters they have, and how many attacks against us they're conducting, sometimes against our allies. And we've been able to drive, in many cases, those numbers very close down to zero. And we have not accounted for the fact that for many of the groups, it actually is about controlling governance and not land. And this is where I see Al-Qaeda as a longer-term threat, and the efforts that it's made to transform how Syrian society functions in Idlib province in northwest Syria. The United States does not really have a policy that I've heard articulated to counter this effort. The other side of it is we actually have challenges with our partners in defining who our enemies are. The Islamic State is fairly easy. Any member of the Islamic State, we can say, yes, ISIS is so far beyond the pale that our partners, including our Gulf allies, agree. Al-Qaeda, a little bit hairier. They have to be kind of true Al-Qaeda members who are committed to global jihad and talking about attacks against the United States or attacks against so-called apostate Muslim regimes. when you start to get to some of the more local versions of Al-Qaeda and the other Salafi jihadi groups, it gets very, very gray very, very quickly. And we have a NATO ally that is supporting a group that the United States has designated as a terrorist organization. And I have not seen action to try and pull that apart. So there's a lot of challenges when you're looking at the terrorism threat and what we're doing. And the other part of it is Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State and other groups like them are not going to get out of Syria as long as the civil war persists. So we're looking at a very, very interrelated conflict.
So Norm, what about that? They've got this. You got this interrelated conflict. The president's saying we've defeated ISIS or the Islamic State. Katie says not exactly. Dana says they've suffered a territorial defeat. What's your view? Where are we on the fight with ISIS? Should we be worried about Al-Qaeda in the region? And in any event, is Katie right that this is all about the Syrian civil war and these groups aren't going anywhere until the Syrian civil war is solved? And we definitely have not solved that problem.
And Katie's correct. We have defeated the ISIS caliphate. It is no more. There are thousands of ISIS operatives inside of Syria today, and they represent a threat to the United States and to the region. Those are facts. Al-Qaeda and other such elements are in the Idlib area, and that is also a fact. You will not be able to defeat these elements simply in Syria because they have now metastasized into North Africa, into Yemen, where Al-Qaeda and ISIS are fighting, one of the many wars of Yemen, and around the world. So terrorism as a whole, this becomes a long-term battle. The resources that Dana correctly stated that have been applied to the area where the Kurds are operating, that is important. We need to get the stabilization teams back in country because as we're building good governance in those areas, as in places like Yemen, you're able to push back on ISIS and Al-Qaeda. You're able to offer alternatives for people. But I think the conflict has changed from just the Syrian civil war. It may have started that way at one time. I think Syria's DNA has been changed by Iran in ways we don't really realize. And going back to my comment earlier on Iran, there has not been one penny authorized by Congress to push back against Iran in Syria. There isn't one ally, and many in the United States, who would actually support the serious measures needed to push Iran out of Syria. A map of Syria has our forces in the northeast and in the southeast. There is very little Iran there. Iran is in the west. If you want to stop Iran's forces in the west, we have not been able to do it with our 2,000 plus forces there thus far, and the Israelis have had to conduct 300 plus airstrikes. So anyone who thinks that what we're doing is stopping Iran, look at those airstrikes. We may have slowed it down a bit. You want to stop it? Stop all air flights from Tehran to Damascus. Ask our European allies if they're in favor of that. Ask those people who support the JCPOA deal in the United States if they would be in favor of taking such an action. That's where this gets complicated.
So Dana, what about that? Is that the real challenge? We've got the Iranian support for Hezbollah, but now it's gone beyond that. You've got IRGC, Quds forces in country operating there openly without question. Can we effectively, is there a way for the U.S. to effectively push back on Iran and Syria, or is that game just up and it's never going to happen?
It doesn't strike me that the American people or members of Congress that would need to authorize and appropriate funds for such a policy to really push back on Iran and Syria or remove Iranian presence in Syria. We are not ready here to have that conversation. You can even see in the past week and a half how many members of Congress introduced legislation to make it clear that Congress will not authorize use of force against Iran, just to get a sense of the political temperature, at least on the Hill. Nor, frankly, has the administration presented a plan for what it would actually take to remove Iranian presence from Syria. It was interesting that Norm said, we are not, or we have done X, Y, and Z about Iran and Syria, because really we are not doing much at all. We have outsourced this to the Israelis. The Israelis are doing airstrikes. They are taking kinetic action. We probably support it in various ways, but it is not the United States taking direct action. And furthermore, this isn't just about military options. I agree. Iran has changed the DNA of Syria. They are purchasing real estate. They are changing the nature of religious institutions, religious areas of prayer, schools, etc. There are reports of Iranians offering incentives to Arab tribes, even in Syria. So this goes way beyond just military options, military investment, Iranian militias. There are reports of Iranian infiltration of the Syrian army. So in terms of how you unwind this and how you actually remove Iran, A, I don't think we're prepared to have that conversation, and B, I've never seen an actual plan for how to do that in the first place.
So, Katie, if Dana and Norm are right that Iran's run amok in Syria, and that's partly empowered by their alliance with Hezbollah or their support of their proxy force in Hezbollah, what do we do about that? What do we do about the fact that Hezbollah is essentially, they used to run Lebanon, now they're largely serving as Assad's army in Syria? What do we do about the fact that we've got a well-known, largely internationally recognized terrorist group that's essentially serving as an armed force for a country that doesn't have as effective ones it might?
Pass. No. I think that what we need to do is actually untangle some of the complications in our policy where, as Dana noted, we're actually looking for a political resolution to the original conflict, to the civil war. And the way that we have operated on the ground, specifically the way that we decided to combat the Islamic State and to reduce our dealings with the Syrian armed opposition to be those fighters who are willing to fight against the Islamic State has basically meant that we have enabled the Assad regime to take back most of the territory. We've built up a Kurdish force that does have some Arab components, but most of the Arabs in Syria do see it as a Kurdish entity. And then the Arabs that had opposed the Assad regime have fundamentally been abandoned by the United States, which means that any negotiated settlement is not one that would be acceptable to them. So this is a challenge we face. And to move Hezbollah out at this point, it's going to be a much longer term effort. And I fundamentally don't see the way forward until the conflict is ended.
So, Norm, is there a solution to this conflict?
No, not in the near term. But I wanted to go back to actually the Iran angle. There have been successes against Iran, and they're important. Iran moved to Syria with a variety of goals, one of which was to establish a large missile base and probably a naval base. That has not occurred.
But is that because of us or the Russians?
Yes. At the same time, there has been intense diplomacy with the Russians behind the scenes with Secretary Pompeo, to include his recent trip to Sochi. And Russia and Iran were large topics on that relationship. The Russians have prevented, according to press reports, the movement of Iranian and surrogate forces in Syrian military uniforms from the Golan Heights area and in the West. This said, where Russia is not in Syria, so we're looking at the Syria-Iraq border where there are large movements of Iranian surrogates and Iranian forces, the Iranians are reshaping, I would say, the political security DNA of that area. When it comes down to what the U.S. can do, so Dana asked the great question, what is the actual plan? The answer is there are a lot of things you can do, and all those in favor of military conflict with Iran and Syria, raise your hand. We have a vote. The sanctions on Iran are having an impact on their activity in the Levant area. This is something that will be very difficult for people to see and very difficult to measure and relatively easy to discount. But again, having been out of the government for a year and a half, but having done this for 34 years, and I feel like I've seen this movie 4 or 5 times. We keep coming back to sort of the same areas. I get a sense of how the gears are all working in that part of the world. We're actually slowing down what Iran is doing in that area and giving time for diplomacy or a political solution, which I believe is very unlikely in the near term to take place. But this is why God made such people as Jim Jaffer and other diplomats.
So give peace a chance, but peace isn't likely. But Dana, Norm said something interesting that I want to talk a little bit more about. So this idea that the reinstated sanctions pressure, the sort of Trump administration decision to get out of JCPOA, reimpose the sanctions, go back to maximum pressure, that might actually be slowing Iran down, whether it's in Syria or in Yemen. If that's right, Is that the right policy? Is it working? And if so, what comes next?
Well, that's the question, right? What comes next? So I would say one of the criticisms of the current Iran policy is that it seems to be sanctions only. If it's slowing Iran down, that's great. The question is it achieving the stated objective of the United States, which is the removal of all Iranian boots from Syria? I don't see that happening right now. In terms of what the Iranians are doing in Yemen, since you brought up Yemen, Syria is different, but Yemen is actually quite low cost, plausible deniability, light footprint. It doesn't cost that much to give the Houthis some training, some equipment, and then just perpetually, and the Iranians, right? And then just consistently threaten the Saudis, who have responded with an overwhelming coalition that has provoked tremendous ire from the international community. In Syria, if it's working, that's fine. The question is does the United States and its allies and partners have the strategic patience to let those sanctions play out for year after year after year, to then get to some point at which the Iranian support financially, militarily, politically, etc., for the Assad regime is tenuous enough that Assad may be willing to consider some concessions or some political compromise. That I don't see happening in the near term. So if the objective is sustainable, enduring political process and removal of all Iranian boots, it would have to be Assad deciding to break with Iran, and it would have to be the Russians asserting and finding the political will and compelling Assad and Iran to remove all Iranian boots from Syria. It hasn't happened yet, and I don't see it happening.
So, Katie, and by the way, for the audience, we're going to come to you for questions in the next 5 to 10 minutes. So please have some questions ready. I can keep doing this for hours. So, Katie, Dana lays out this idea that there really is no solution in the offing in the immediate term. Norm has said the same thing. I think you have the same view. So what are we doing there? Shouldn't we just get out of Dodge, bring our men and women home, and let as I think candidate Trump may have said, or at least thought, right? Let Allah sort it out, right? Let them fight it out. We'll worry about us. They'll worry about them. Game on. The Iranians want to run that part of the world. That's fine. We've got crushing sanctions on them. They'll come to the table on the nuclear deal, and I'll make a better deal than Obama did. What about that?
As unlikely as we are to secure our interests now, leaving means that we literally hand them over to Iran and Russia. And it's one of those things where the decisions that have been made on Syria over the past 8 to 10 years have reduced the number of American policy options repeatedly, have made it much less likely that we will actually achieve our own objectives, and frankly have helped to enable our adversaries inside of the country. There is no way that Putin will decide to push Iran out of Syria, because he relies upon the Hezbollahi support to the Assad regime and the Iranian support to the Assad regime to secure his military base, which has nothing to do with Syria. So Putin is playing a much more global game inside of Syria and sees it for its basing on the Eastern Mediterranean as a way to push the United States out of the Middle East, which I would say he's done a little bit effectively. He's certainly constrained our military, the ability of our Air Force to fly over Syria. And the Iranians are also playing a regional game here. And this is one of the challenges that I think that we have when we're looking at the region, is we tend to look at it as a Syria problem. And it is a Syria problem. But we haven't looked at it also as part of the Russia problem set, part of the Iranian problem set, part of the Salafi Jihadi problem set. And we haven't actually taken a step back and seen the region and all the complexity in full. That's not an answer about what we should do. And I don't actually see the way forward, given the limited resources that we are willing to do. I think some of the recommendations that Dana and Norm have made are very clear. We pulled out our Start Forward efforts, so the stabilization efforts, where we had state and aid on the front line. That was one of the first things to close down when Trump tweeted that we were moving out of Syria, and it hasn't restarted. That means that our only footprint is a military footprint. We have our diplomatic engagements, but as we all know, diplomacy is only so much if there's not hard power behind it. And this president has made very clear that hard power is going to be used very sparingly, or
Or not at
or
all.
not at all. Or sometimes you'll let some things happen and some of us get excited and then there's no follow-up.
So Norm, what about all that? So Katie says it's partly a product of the last 8 to 10 years of American failed foreign policy in the Middle East. The decision to sort of try to pivot away from that region, focus on other parts of the world, pull our troops back home, and that this president is largely continuing that policy, although he may purport to be more aggressive. Right? He's not really willing to put the boots on the ground behind it. Is that right? And if that's right, what would you, if you were the king of the world for a minute, or at least the president of the United States, what would you do tomorrow to address this issue?
I would kill my Twitter account. Then I'd resign, I think, at that point. These are extraordinarily difficult and complicated questions, and the policymakers, not only from this and the previous administrations that I have watched face to face across from the table, at least one of whom is sitting in the room from the military perspective, have all had impossible hurricanes thrown amongst them with the lives of Americans and other people behind it, and the knowledge that whatever they do would face great criticism from the great and generally uninformed people of the public. Your allies are supportive, but they can't replace you, and they generally aren't going to be able to do the things that you want to do. We have an awful lot of European support inside of Syria. Have you seen Federica Mogherini give out one statement of any consequence asking Iran to leave Syria? Plenty of statements on the nuclear deal, but the EU foreign minister, one statement. So the consequences when you manage a policy, when you manage an issue such as this, is it's really easy to say, we should do it this or worse. You get an awful lot of what I call paralysis through analysis. It's let me tell you how bad this is for 40 minutes of a 42-minute meeting, and then close it with somebody should fix it for a minute. And then we all sit for the last minute and say, let's plan the next meeting. The issues we need to address in this conflict are going to be long-term. We want to avoid things getting worse. The administration, right or wrong, has frozen the battlefield. Right or wrong, you're not going to get refugees to come back until you have an economic and security situation which will require dramatic changes in Syria. And that's not going to happen without dramatic aid. And that's not going to happen without dramatic changes of Syrian policy. The Russians have started to show, based on my understanding from individuals who apparently would know, some discomfort with Iran's robust activity in a way that it might stand in the way of European dollars to build essentially the pile of rubble they now own in the Levant. And they're interested in having a base, but they're not interested in having an ISIS war forever, and they're not interested in having a pile of rubble around that base. So I think this is something you just have to say long-term, what are we going to do, knowing that Europe will be there potentially with money, but not with military forces, that the Kurds who have fought bravely, and the Arabs, by the way, in that area too, they're Arabs, very bravely, taking many losses against ISIS, need to have support. Turkey remains a complicated NATO ally, and the word NATO is an important part of that sentence. And the Arabs need to play a large role, and their values are a little different from ours, in essentially an Arab state. Iran will never leave Syria, but that doesn't mean that it can't be removed to the point where it's not able to fire missiles on Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Israel, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's moderating our expectations, giving more time, and generally appreciating the fact that the people who have to deal with this aren't any smarter than you. They don't have any more data overall than you. So when people say, what's the plan? I would turn to someone like you and say, ma'am, what's your plan? And if you don't have one, it's generally a thought that the people sitting around the table at the NSC don't have that much more in terms of options than you. I apologize for going on so long, but I've just watched this movie. As I say, this is my 7th or 8th conflict, and I've seen this happen 4 or 5 times. Thank you.
So Dana, that's pretty dark, right? It's a long-term situation. Nobody's got a good plan. There's not really a good plan to be had. It's really complicated. A lot of different issues: Russia, Iran, Turkey, the Kurds. I mean, you name it, terrorism, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. I mean, you name it. The Syrian refugees, the Syrian conflict has it all.
I want to know where you're going with this question.
Chemical weapons.
Okay.
If you were the king of the world or the president of the United States for the next month, what do you do?
I think it's actually largely continuity with the current policy, unfortunately.
That's
which is
it?
The reality is the American public is not willing to tolerate a greater military investment, and our military investment to date is actually pretty low cost compared to other involvement in conflicts, and we have coalition contributions. And it's not just the Europeans who have money, it's the Americans who have money for reconstruction aid. And Jim Jeffrey's actually been extremely clear about this, that there will be no reconstruction aid until there's a political transition. And the Russians are knocking on all sorts of doors and are trying to use the threat of refugees not returning as some sort of leverage to compel the Europeans to pay up now. And so what the United States still has, even though I stand by what I said earlier, which is lower credibility of the United States at this point in time, we do still have influence in international financial institutions, and we still have money, and we shouldn't be spending that money until some of the fundamentals of this conflict change.
All right, so Katie, I'm gonna try and bait you with the question, and if you won't take the bait, then I'll try and take the bait myself. And then next we'll turn to the audience for questions. But so you have Dana, who served on the Democratic staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, saying continue the Trump policy in Syria, I think. You have Norm Roule, who was a national intelligence manager for Iran over multiple administrations.
Though, I don't see that much diversion from the Trump policy from the Obama policy either. In the end, it's still relatively light resource investments and very lofty goals without sort of having the honest conversation with Congress or with the American public about what this conflict is, how difficult it is, and failing to take into account that this isn't just about a Syrian conflict. This is about great power competition and what we're going to do about Russia and the foothold that it has been given in the Middle East.
Okay, so I'm going to reframe that in a way that colors with my own politics, right? And I'll say, so we're going to continue the failed policies that brought us here in the new administration, and we'll just stick with the same plan. And I know I'm just tweaking you a little bit, right? But Katie, I want to see if you will take the position that in fact that's wrong. We should get much more aggressive and fast, and that the role of the president in this situation should be to lead the American people into convincing them that this is a fight worth fighting and a fight worth winning, both against Russia and Iran. And this part of the region of the world does matter, and maybe we do need to. Maybe it does require sacrificing some lives. Will you lead that effort, Katie?
Not alone, Jamil, but
I'll argue that.
So I think that's actually probably where Dana and I diverge a little bit. Is that I agree that there's no appetite for increased investment in the Middle East writ large, but I also see a massive leadership gap here in the United States about, and it's not just the Middle East, but actually from Congress about why the United States should be invested in our foreign policy abroad and what our dollars actually buy the American people in terms of a global economy which has been set up to benefit the United States. All of that aside, I think that there are challenges that we face when we're looking at Syria where the United States is just not ready to go all in at this point, even if we had an all-in strategy. And, the problems that I see is that we haven't actually started the machinations of planning for what could be. And that, the Trump administration has been here for 2 years and we still have effectively the Obama administration's policy with some shifts in terms of authorities or permissions, and it hasn't changed that much. But one of the reasons it hasn't changed that much is we haven't thought about what else we could be doing differently and how to approach the problem differently. To pull Hezbollah out, maybe there's some pressure in Lebanon. The Hezbollah presence in Syria is not actually that acceptable to Lebanese. So we can talk about using a more asymmetrical approach and a more regional approach, which I don't think has really come into the policy discussion on Syria about playing a global or regional game against our adversaries in the Middle East rather than just responding to them theater by theater.
Yeah. Norm.
So two quick comments. When you have a discussion now about the Trump administration's policy on Iran, you will often hear, because we raised sanctions against Iran, oil sanctions, they have threatened our troops in Iraq and the region. Let's put that in a pile. Okay.
Never mind, they were killing them for years.
Go with the flow.
During the Iraq
608 during the Iraq War. That was classified in my time, recently unclassified, and the number of wounded is far more significant. Far more significant. Put that aside. The Trump administration came in saying it was going to roll back Iran in the region. Is there anyone who thinks that rolling Iran back in the region would not include an Iranian attempt to respond to that in a kinetic way? Can you roll back Iran in the region or Lebanese Hezbollah in the region without one of these stinkers saying, I will kill you if you do that? So this is not, there are no surprises here. For a couple of years, people have thought about this and looked at this. My second point is you have to put a Venn diagram together. Take your Iraq policy. And for the last 10 years, our job has been keep Iraq together. That's the goal.
Yeah.
And we have a coalition to say it hasn't broken in many little states, a coalition of states who were with us on that. Work against ISIS, another international coalition. And then you have push Iran back in the region. Put those three together.
Much smaller coalition, unfortunately.
Much smaller coalition. Put those three together in a Venn diagram and look for that little spot of overlap where the existing resources, authority, personnel, and military packages in the region, which must be balanced against issues ranging from China to Europe to everywhere else. None of this works alone. We've had these repeated discussions as a nation internally to say, how do you manage this as a region, as a global area? And you get that little Venn diagram, because right now that's what we can do. Now, we can take it a step up. We can stop all Iranian planes going from Tehran. You all have to live with that, American people, right? We can go against Lebanese Hezbollah. We can shut down the Lebanese central bank. You all have to live with that the day after. We can take an Arab capital, which is what Syria was until recently, and say over to really Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the Emirates, and others. You guys write its constitution, not Russia, Iran, and Turkey. Say what you want, but very strange that these three countries are writing an Arab country's constitution. But there are day after consequences.
We're all happy to be doing it.
They're all delighted to be doing it. I just think that the day after consequences are really where we tend to freeze up as we go through solutions. Although I've never been policy prescriptive because my job has been just describing what we know and what we don't know. But I think mentally I'm with you, Jamil, on a number of the ways forward. And I'll pause there.
Dana, last thoughts before we go to the audience for questions, if any. You don't have to have any. All right. To the audience, let's start with this gentleman back there. And I'll repeat your question. If you just want to say it, I'll repeat it for you. So go ahead and stand up and well, only for the tape, audio taping, sir.
First of all, a comment and a question. The initial comment is Katherine's role for WPG because it's not just the issue of getting out of Syria, it is a critical one. When we went into Syria, it was a limited mission, limited scope, and limited outcomes. We went in for the simple reason, and have been in there for the simple reason, defeating ISIS. That's the only mandate. It's the foreign policy community in the city that has decided that not only are we going to do what we're supposed to do, which we have done, but we're now going to add all these other Christmas tree objectives. Well, one of the reasons we're failing there is because when we went in, it was never designed for us to have the voice of Astana, never had the voice of Sochi. We had absolutely no reason to be in Syria except to defeat ISIS. Even Jim Jeffries admitted that all these other Christmas tree objectives we had set up, well, that's great, but we never went in to do that. We were not resourced when we went in to do that. And all of a sudden, now that we make that an objective, and to criticize this administration because we're leaving Syria after we've done the job that we signed up to do, I think that's a harsh criticism and unfair. On the issue, don't worry, Norm. I was the guy who all this at the end of those 42 minutes. You say, what are we going to do about this? You turn to the DFD and say, you guys go do it. But the question that I really want to ask is, even though there's one U.S. role in Syria, the U.S. operations against Iran, the question I got is, it seemed to me like you were the only one who made mention of it. Why do we continue to get the critical role in Turkey, who, oh, by the way, as we say, Turkey's supporting a terrorist organization? They, in fact, are saying to us, you're supporting a terrorist organization as well. So tell me about the consequences of continuing our breakup with Turkey for purposes of controlling small land in Syria.
So the question, just to make sure I have it right, is what are the consequences of our continuing our breakup with Turkey on this key issue of what's going on in the region, and particularly with respect to Syria? There's our support of the Kurds, there's support of groups responding to the Kurds, and does that result in worse consequences in the long run? Is that?
No, I don't think you got it right. You used the wrong key. You said, what is the issue of breaking up with a key ally for the purpose of contemporaneous and soon-to-be opposition in Syria that doesn't really have consequences in the United States?
So your question is about whether maybe it's better to get him a mic. We don't have, unfortunately we don't have roving mics. I apologize. Yeah.
What's more important, maintaining a relationship with a NATO ally or finishing up the job in Syria?
There you go. Fair enough. What's more important?
How was you, Norm?
You, Norm.
Well, that's an easy one. Turkey is extraordinarily complicated. NATO ally. There's some aspects of their domestic politics where we disagree. The purchase of the S-400 we have problems with. At the same time, massive population, incredibly important geopolitical location, massive economy, and they're on the north of of Syria. I think the question is, you've got a guy like Jim Jeffrey, again, who is ambassador to Ankara, who truly understands them. He's the right guy to work the complicated diplomatic process to give the Turks what I think, to be fairly said, is a natural role in the affairs of a failed state on their southern border. We had this on a failed state on our border. We would want a large role too. The question becomes, how again does that play in with the other partners? I think that the Iranians are probably afraid of a neo-Ottoman expansion of the Turks. I've always wondered what would happen if they bumped into each other in Aleppo or Idlib. I think you've got the issue of Syria and Turkey. They have a charged relationship for many years. And finally, of course, the Kurdish issue, where there are many who say that if the Turks come into Syria, they will slaughter the Kurds. I don't think the word slaughter is the appropriate word. I don't think that's possible simply because the Kurds are such magnificent fighters. But there is the problem of PKK terrorism. That's not an unrealistic concern for Turkey. In the end, I think you have to recognize the Kurdish concerns and have, again, that superb diplomat, Jim Jeffrey, over months and months, work this as best you can in the policy hurricane that is Syria.
Dana, thoughts?
I just don't think it has to be an either or. I think we can stabilize and preserve our relationship with Turkey because it's a NATO ally, because I agree with you, it's not working out, but that doesn't mean it has to end in divorce. I don't think that in the context of, for example, you had your days at the Pentagon, the National Defense Strategy, if we are moving from a CT focus to a great power competition focus, do we want Turkey in our camp or in Russia's camp? So I think we have to look for ways. I agree. I think Jim Jeffrey is the right guy at this time to work those issues day in and day out. And at the time that we made the decision to work with the SDF and the Kurds within the SDF, there was conversation after conversation after conversation with the Turks about, if not the Kurds, show us what that alternate fighting force is that can deal with the near-term emergency of this terrorist force ISIS seizing these huge swaths of territory in Iraq and Syria, and there was never a compelling alternate fighting force. So we've made commitments to the SDF. They're holding territory, northeast Syria, rich in agriculture, rich in hydrocarbons. The Assad wants in, the Russians want in. That's some leverage for us if we do want to affect our other priorities like Iran. You're shaking your head, but listen, the Trump administration has articulated 3 objectives. They have said our interests in Syria are not just defeating ISIS. The Trump administration. That's not Christmas tree, ornamental think tank people in Washington, D.C. That's the administration articulating that policy. What are the sources of leverage we have at this point in time if we're not going to go all in with military or go to Congress and authorize use of force against Iran or the Assad regime, etc.? It's sanctions, it's diplomacy, it's assistance, and it's that territory we hold through the SDF. So I think the honest thing to do is acknowledge Turkey's security concerns, continue to work that issue, but it doesn't have to be an either or.
Katie, thoughts?
I'm going to agree very much with Dana here. And, I disagreed with the policy when the Obama administration made it, and I disagree now with the Trump administration that we're holding on to it. And I agree, we weren't resourced in terms of what we're trying to do. So the Trump administration hasn't added resources while it has expanded our objectives inside of Syria. So I think that critique is very fair. But when we're looking at a NATO ally, this is the challenge that we have, is that we must actually keep Turkey in our camp. We have a lot of challenges with Erdogan for his political and religious views and how he's transformed some of the Turkish state and his efforts elsewhere. But I do think that it can be balanced with the interests in Syria. And at this point, the die has been cast. So there's only one way to move, and that's forward. So it's going to take a lot of diplomacy and kind of real politics to get this off of kind of the crisis scenario.
Great. Okay, sir, here in the front.
My question is somewhat related to the last one, and that is, what is our policy, short-term and long-term, for Kurds?
Dana.
Since your question is what is the policy, I think the response is there isn't a policy. The short-term policy of the administration is to continue supporting the Kurds within the Syrian Democratic Forces. It's in their budget request. So even though there are mixed messages about how long our U.S. military will be staying and what the follow-on missions of the U.S. military in Syria will be, the administration is still requesting funding for us to stay there and continue working with the Kurds. As to what is the long-term policy, I have not heard an articulation as to what it is.
Norm?
I can't add much to what Dana stated in her excellent presentation, other than saying I think there's a general recognition that although there is a great fondness for the Kurds who have done so splendidly against ISIS, as well as their Arab allies in the area, and I want to lay that forward as well, I'm not sure there's any enthusiasm for another micro-state in the Middle East right now at this particular time with so many other things happening.
I would just add, though, you can see there are sprinklings of what the debate looks like inside the administration. So Brett McGurk, the former presidential envoy for the Defeat ISIS coalition, wrote an article in Foreign Affairs where he basically said, everybody knows the U.S. military is leaving. The Kurds are going to be on their own. They face these threats from Turkey and from the Assad regime. They should cut a deal with the Assad regime. Now, it doesn't appear that the Assad regime is interested in any sort of deal that would be acceptable to Syria's Kurds, but that is one side of the debate. And on the other side, you do have Jim Jeffrey, who's saying that our alliance with the Kurds is tactical. So what does that mean in terms of a long-term strategy or policy? Again, I can't answer the question, but you can see that there is at least thinking inside the executive branch as to what that policy should be.
Great. Ma'am, here in the front.
So much for this presentation. I'm a Kurdish from the north of Syria, U.S. representative of Syrian Democratic Council, which is the SDF political umbrella. I would like to ask here, we know the sensitivity of the relationship between the U.S. and Turkey. We know that, we understand it very well. And they are the allies and the NATO member for the U.S. At the same time, the SDF, the Kurdish also, and the North administration, they are also the allies of the US. But unfortunately, both allies, they are not together. They are about to fight. And this is a threat of the Turkey against the north of Syria. This happened. So how could, or what's the role of the United States to play in order to have the stability in the north of Syria and not to make both allies for the United States to fight or to have some conflict together? Thank you so much.
So it's a great question, and I want to repeat my previous statement that the SDF, the Kurds, have fought heroically against ISIS, and whereas we have had casualties less than a handful, they have had thousands in that fight. And whatever your views are in the Kurdish-Turkish issues, I think you have to honor the sacrifice of their fighters in a common cause, and that's something we shouldn't forget. I think there are three aspects to the Trump administration policy. Sometimes it gets a lot of criticism, but I think it deserves some focus. The pullout from northeast Syria, I understand why we should stay there to be with the partners who have fought so well. At the same time, 2,000 troops aren't keeping Iran out of Damascus. They're not pushing Bashar al-Assad out of Damascus. And they were doing a great work with ISIS and empowering or working with our partners. I think we need to bring in other nations to help empower the Kurdish people to keep up that fight against ISIS. And I think stabilization assistance in terms of dollars, in terms of expertise, in terms of that angle should be brought in. And again, tough and routine diplomacy with Turkey to make sure that the relationships are understood, and the buffer zone that has been so difficult to establish between the two elements, that's going to get established, whether it's 30 kilometers or 20 kilometers or local policemen or international policemen. I think it's important to look in that direction as well. But I want to close as I began by saying thousands of Kurds have died in a common fight. It's their fight as well as ours, and Arabs, against ISIS, and we should honor that.
Sir, here in the middle, and then I got this gentleman at the back there. So, sir, right here.
Yeah, it's Bassam. I'm from Syria. I think we should talk about the future, not the past. Today we cannot go, is it the U.S. choose for the SDF is right, is wrong, or whatever. It's done. Nothing. It's reacted. The Kurds are part of Syria, and they should be part of Syria, and we should be with them. So in fact, I don't have to say just answer. I don't think the United States should interfere in Syria militarily in order to beat Iran. Iran is Shia, Persian, they are in Sunni Arab area. They don't have constituents to support them the way they have the Lebanon, Iraq. They don't have the room to stay. I think the best policy for the United States in Syria is just definitely to support them. Show them the message is consistent, pushing forward. They cannot survive for long term. The same for Al-Qaeda, the same for ISIS, and the same for them. So it's about the United States to choose the right partner at the right time. When the United States chooses Sahawat, Sahawat, the Sunni, against ISIS in Iraq, you win. And when you choose the SDF at that circumstance, you win. According to McGirt, I think he's always believed that the SDF should, of the geographical area, should back to Syria, but he always forget that the people, the regime, always kill the Kurds. And he never gave them the ID. He never recognized the ID as people that exist in Syria for 50 years. Can you imagine people that you have an ID? So I don't think he's logical the way he approached Syria, and I think because of his bad policy, we are where we are. Thank you.
Sir at the back.
Let me introduce myself differently from the way I did first time. I am a Trump Republican. I belong to the Trump Republican. All these things that you are talking about, the same things. I said, do due diligence for any intelligence report you got. Historically, the intelligence of America have always fabricated evidence, etc., etc. Secondly, you want to argue about that? I've been here since 1967. So I'm talking about. Okay. Now, listen. I've said to him, if he intervened in Venezuela, it would have been looked like an ass. If he intervened in Syria, it would be looked as an ass, my horse. I've said those two. Now, before they're calling for Bolton to be fired, I'm the one who said to him, look, tell Bolton to go shout the Monroe document under his household. Because Monroe document was the one that's responsible for the...
Okay, but do you have a question, sir?
That thing, what I'm saying is, what you also recommend to Trump to get out of Syria.
Okay, great. Sir, here in the front.
I have a very important question for both of the arena. What is the percentage of resources allocated to human intelligence, specifically pertaining to funding of these ISIS organizations? I don't know whether I got it right.
How much money do we spend on the ISIS threat?
Money.
Intel.
We need to track the money.
Okay. I don't know that number is to the extent
The
that
United
number is-
States does not and has never funded an ISIS organization.
The United States, sir. I'm trying to figure out the financial, like there's certain organizations which are non-profit. So let's say, I don't want to say any particular religion or anything. Let's say we fund that non-profit organization and they in turn fund the ISIS. Everything is coming out of money. Where is the money coming and going? Is what I'm trying to.
Well, sir, I think that if your question's about U.S. efforts to counter funding of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, we obviously engage in aggressive counterterrorism funding efforts. The Treasury Department, State Department, the U.S. Justice Department has brought numerous charges against charities and the like to combat funding of terrorism. Certainly there's more to be done there at all times. and it's certainly an issue. But I don't know that I can quote you a number or what those organizations are, other than the ones that we have.
I'm aware
indicted.
of that number, and we have our partners in the region, particularly since 2003, and specifically since 2011, have dramatically reduced the amount of money that goes from the region to these elements. And I'm talking here mainly about the Kuwaitis, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis. I mean, you can talk about specific elements or areas they support, but the amount of money that goes to ISIS and Al-Qaeda type organizations from the Gulf Arabs has been dramatically reduced since 2003, but I'm not sure there's a number I'm aware of.
In fact, this country, India, where black money is 60% of it, where it gets funneled, are we working with enough partners to tackle the problem? To move a mountain, we need to work with people.
So I think that's a reasonable point, that we need to work with additional organizations to address the problem of funding and of terrorist groups. Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Alex Miller. What would, given the resources, what would you guess best estimate be a feasible final state that we could achieve in Syria, assuming the resources?
So if we were well-resourced, Norm, what could we achieve realistically? Is that the question? Yeah.
I'm unable to answer that because we're talking about when people say what would you do against Iran in the region, there are a lot of things you can do. This is like a menu at a restaurant. Each one has profound consequences the day after. I mean, getting rid of Bashar al-Assad, there are plenty of ways that, in theory, that could have been done militarily, or even had the Russians not come in before, or in 2015-14 period, or the Iranians in 13. But I mean, I don't really know where we're going to. The famous Petraeus statement of "So how does this end?" is something that I think has baffled the region as well as U.S. policymakers for many years. I think we have to twist this around just a little bit and say, what do we want to avoid? I call it the staring in the bathroom mirror in your morning every day and say, who do I see? We don't want to see more people displaced. There are 11 million Syrians who don't have their home. There are hundreds of thousands who are dead. There is a generation without medical care and education. That we have to fix. So maybe what I would turn your question around to say, and I don't have an answer because I'm not policy prescriptive, is not what we want to do, but what we want to avoid, because action has a consequence, but non-action has a consequence as well. So our involvement in this conflict should continue simply so that we can prevent worse things from happening. And Dana may have something more to add.
No, I think it's very easy, especially here in Washington, to talk about what we should be aiming for that is viable as a decentralized state or a confederation or something like this. There are some milestones that people like to talk about, whether or not the Constitutional Committee will be successfully, meaningfully inclusive enough for a new constitution in Syria and then a referendum, and will the 2021 elections that the current Syrian constitution calls for credibly include the Syrian diaspora, which could then vote Assad out of office, why the Assad regime or the Russians or Iranians who have the resource investment and staying power in Syria to consent to some sort of electoral cycle that would have Assad voted out is beyond me. So I don't see any of these things as viable. I agree with Norm, though. It's something we should consider, which is popular with this administration. It's not about regime change. It's about change in the behavior of the regime. So we should be talking about a regime that doesn't torture, starve, conscript people, that doesn't drop barrel bombs, that doesn't use chemical weapons, that doesn't send huge refugee outflows that destabilize the entire region, that doesn't then change the laws of Syria so those refugees are stripped of their ownership rights and land and can't come back in. So there are things to be discussed in terms of what the future is. But again, I think herein lies the problem of a political process, is no one can tell you how it ends. But certainly whatever would be acceptable to the United States or the Europeans is certainly not what the Russians or the Iranians are aiming for. And again, our resource investments are never going to match theirs.
Or Lebanese, Hezbollah.
So Katie, we started with you and we will end with you. Any last thoughts or comments in response to Admiral Miller's question?
I think that, one of the questions that doesn't get asked that often is, what does failure look like for us? And what...
It looks like
what we have. but in my opinion, but also, what are the resources that we actually need to invest in order to prevent more dramatic failure for the United States? We always ask, what does success look like in Syria? And it is some lofty goal that every analyst and anyone who's worked in Syria knows that we will not be able to achieve unless we put in a ton of resources, which we will not do. But the question about what resources we need to keep in Syria and how we need to keep it within our policy is, if the United States were to pull out militarily, what does that mean? That means that our European partners also pull out militarily. What does that mean? That means that Iran and Russia and Turkey have effectively access to Syria without any Western counterpart, which you can then play forward what their policies might look like. What does that mean for terrorism? It probably means that the Islamic State, which has been so thoroughly defeated that it is never going to come back again, is going to come back again inside of Syria. And it's going to come back in a very different form. It means that al-Qaeda will continue to spread in various ways. And that starts to hit against other American interests. On the same side, if we talk about shifting support from the SDF because they are a partner, but they've accomplished our goals that we set out for them as partners, they now face a massive crisis inside of their own territory where they have refugee or displaced persons camps that now actually are the restoration of the caliphate inside the camp. It's something that I think our strategy didn't really recognize, that the Islamic State and the caliphate was not tied to the physical terrain upon which it was holding, but that it is actually within the people that believe in the Islamic State and they can recreate it wherever they want. The SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, and their partners don't have the resources to deal with this problem. So if we leave, that lets that problem fester again. And I think that when we start to stack that up and then add on to it the humanitarian concerns, some of which Dana laid out, and our European partners' concerns, we start to look at this and say, actually, it is in America's interest to remain in Syria, and maybe it might be in our interest long term to invest a little bit more heavily now so that we're not looking at a perpetual investment of resources over the next 20, 30 years, as we've done inside of other states where we have had a very small military footprint.
Okay, great. Thank you all. If you'd join me in thanking the panel.